Good morning, everyone. My name is Scott Stevenson. I'm the Senior Vice President for Trade for BAFT. I want to welcome you to our Reinforcing and Streamlining the Three Lines of Defense webinar. I particularly want to thank John Basquille, Senior Reporter of Global Trade Review, for moderating this panel. Emily Corning-Ved, from Head of Sanctions and Embargo with Danske Bank Group, and thanks very much for joining. And lastly, I'd like to give thanks to Mr. Tim Aquino, who is a compliance solution expert from Windward. Extremely topical webinar that being held this morning. I don't think there's a day that goes by that those of us who are involved in international trade are running into a new sanction. What's unprecedented about what we're seeing this time is there's been sanctions before in terms of a bank, there's been sanctions in terms of individuals, there's been sanctions in terms of an economy, but this time we have three of the tsunamis coming together at the same time. And one of the areas for particular concern has to do with maritime compliance. And that's really where we will be going today. We're not making any political statements here today. We're not opining on the sufficiency of any sanctions that are in place. We're just dealing with the red flags that are out there and how we can best identify. With that, I turn it over to our moderator, John Basquille.
Thank you very much, Scott. It's great to be here. I'm really grateful to BAFT and to Windward for the opportunity to moderate the discussion today, and grateful also to the panelists for joining me. Just before we jump into the discussion, I just say to everyone tuning in, please do submit any questions that you might have for our panelists. If you use the Q&A function, we'll keep an eye on that as we go along and get to as many of those questions as we can. So don't use the chat box because that won't get through to us necessarily. And also don't wait to the end. If you have a question, early on, please feel free to submit that, and we'll get to it if we can. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to our speakers today to set the scene. Tim, perhaps I could start with you, if that's okay. Presumably, as Scott mentioned, the biggest issue for compliance teams at the moment around sanctions is dealing with the situation in Russia and Ukraine. What challenges, from what you've seen, has this presented to compliance teams involved in trade?
Sure, thanks. So, from a maritime standpoint, with that OFAC advisory from last year, or 2020 rather, so 2 years ago, this incumbents to also screen for behavior is also showing us how important that is when you're trying to get ahead of sanctions, because we're seeing in this case how quickly the situation is evolving as far as decisions on what is and what's not sanctioned, what's carved out, what's not carved out. So you really have to have that granular level of detail in order to get ahead of impacts to the bank. It leads to uncertainty in the market, and we're also trying to figure out what other governing bodies, aside strictly from the EU, UN, OFAC, OFSI, are going to be issuing their opinion on the matter. We're now seeing a trend in moral sanctions. And so that comes up as another risk that needs to be screened for. So as far as the scene, it's obviously changing, but accelerating in its change. And so you need to have more nimble information and that decision support and your controls in place up front, because I think we all know that during times of, we'll say, trade crisis, that's going to be a point of inspection under review, how you handle that. And you don't want to appear as though you had lost all control and you're changing everything, but you do need to show that you're reacting.
Absolutely, thank you. So, Amelie, maybe from a bank's perspective, is there anything you would pick up on there? And are there any particular kinds of transactions or particular trade flows, I suppose parts of the world is fairly obvious, but anything in particular that has become significantly more of a challenge?
You would think you'd learn to unmute by now, but obviously not. No, thanks for that, John. And in addition to what Tim said, which I of course do agree with, I think that the compliance challenge related to the war in Ukraine is broader than only sort of affecting the trade landscape, even though that is, of course, one of the targets of the new sanctions. If I sort of reflect back on what's happened over the past really 6 weeks, we've seen unprecedented sanctions imposed against Russia and also Belarus in response to the invasion of Ukraine. And the sanctions are unprecedented, both in terms of their scope and their magnitude and how impactful they are. So we're dealing with an incredibly complex sanctions landscape right now as it relates to trade with Russia, trade through Russia, trade with Russian counterparties, Russian-owned counterparties outside of Russia. So it's an extraordinary compliance challenge. And I think if we sort of look at the different types of sanctions that have been implemented, we of course both have import and export controls, and quite expansive import and export controls, but also sanctions that have been levied on specific financial institutions in Russia. And typically some of the financial institutions that also operated as payment channels in and outside of Russia for Western firms, for US-based firms, for European firms. And a lot of those channels are now closed down. So we see a practical difficulty in establishing the right types of corresponding relationships to be able to physically carry out even the trade that is still permitted. And by the way, that's a window that's closing rapidly. I'm sure everybody on the call will have seen the news on the EU's fifth sanctions package, which was announced last week. And that's a very expansive, very sort of broad package that imposes even stricter sanctions on trade with and involving Russia and Belarus. So I think in terms sort of trade, and also if we look at issues like trade finance, it really is a moment to pause and consider very carefully how you're going to structure specific types of activity to stay within the lines of what the new sanctions really say.
Thank you. And just to pick up on something that Tim said, Amelie, maybe I could ask you for your perspective on this. So obviously the restrictions aren't the same from authority to authority, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Just in practical terms, how can a financial institution stay on top of that?
Right. So I will note that divergence in sanctions regimes and sort of the imposition of sanctions by major authorities, it's not a new thing. We've sort of dealt with divergence in terms of Iran, in terms of Syria to a certain degree, and sort of the application of sanctions globally. So in contrast, the current situation is actually affected by a high level of convergence. There's a lot of coordination. There's a lot of alignment that's gone on between sort of the Western allies. That is clear. But there are, of course, still differences in the specific application and how the sanctions get put into law. And to give a specific example of that, both the European Union and the US has decided to ban exports of luxury goods to Russia. But there is no universal definition of what constitutes a luxury good. Both sets of luxury good lists that have been issued are very broad, but they don't target exactly the same types of categories. So there is legal divergence there that you need to be very careful about. And to answer the question honestly, in terms of how can you sort of manage this? The answer is extremely carefully. You have to operate on the assumption right now that all trade with and involving Russia and Belarus needs to go through an extra level of compliance check to make sure you're not running afoul of any of the new restrictions.
See, okay, and presumably also banks are erring on the side of caution. We've seen some warnings about the reputational risks to banks, even if they are on the right side of the law when it comes to sanctions. Tim, I wondered if you'd seen anything already in Windward's monitoring of shipping activity that might suggest efforts to circumvent sanctions, or if not, what kind of things institutions should be looking out for?
Yeah, so we have done monitoring. From a behavioral standpoint, when you're trying to tease out trends, We're still in early days, but what you can see is that there has been an increase in Russian-linked vessels, and we'll talk later what it means to be Russian-linked. For instance, turning off AIS or adopting some of these deceptive shipping practices that early on we're supposed to monitor against. So you can see that uptick. Again, early days to determine whether that's a trend. I mean, there's also legitimate reasons to be turning off your AIS in, let's say, a war zone. So everything has to be with a caveat, but these are the types of things that we would screen against. And we're also noticing, the expected trends of less port calls as the sanctions get imposed. A steep drop off in what we would consider first-time visits, as far as companies or vessels visiting Russia for the first time or Ukraine for the first time. And some of the linkages are surprising because it's good that they're all going down as far as compliance, what you would expect. So that's what I mean when I say good. But the fact that there are any new first-time visits is still surprising.
Absolutely, yeah. Maybe I could pick up on the point you made there around Russian-linked vessels. Maybe now's a good time to get stuck into that. Yeah, maybe could you talk us through that one?
Yeah. Okay. So it's, and as Amelia mentioned before, definitions are not always prescribed in a uniform way. So you might hear Russian-linked vessel. Okay, so there's a number of ways, and it's incumbent on us, right, to take a risk-based approach as to what it means. The regulators aren't going to define it for us, but they just want to see that we have a program in place. So it could be, for instance, a Russian flagged vessel, it's registered in Russia itself. It was historically flagged in Russia. And when I say flag, I mean actual the flag it was flying. You could say there's a Russian owner in one of the 7 levels of ownership, either charter, operator, third party, registered owner, beneficial owner. It could have a ultimate beneficial owner of any one of those 7 levels of ownership that is ultimately owned by an individual that is, Russian national, Russian politically exposed person, or a shell company registered in Russia. Or you can look at it from a geographic standpoint and said made a port call, let's say, or visited the exclusive economic zones of Russia or territorial waters. So all of those things need to be defined by us when we take a risk-based approach to say, well, what's the sanction nexus here? Because we need to take a conservative approach because the trend is obviously that the sanctions are going to get more and more strict. So being able to rapidly define what it means to be Russian linked along those lines, and then apply, either behavioral ownership or registration information to be able to come up with a box that you can safely check and incorporate into your 3 lines of defense.
Thank you. Amelie, to what extent are those, is that level of sophistication on the radar of the banks?
So I would say to a very high degree, as Tim mentioned sort of at the onset, there's been, let's say, due notice from a number of regulators, including the US's OFAC, of course, to the expectation both to the maritime industry, but also to the financial sector in terms of ensuring compliance, both with the sanctions, but also, as Tim mentioned, through sort of the monitoring and the controls associated with specific behavior, for example, to counteract invasion, all in the name of making the sanctions as effective as possible. So I would say that the technology adoption for this in banks and in the financial sector at large has been quite high. It of course depends a little bit on your exposure. If you're not a bank that does a whole lot of trade finance or have sort of a lot of clients with significant trade, you can sort of take a risk-based approach to that from the perspective of your sanctions compliance program. But by and large, there are a number of screening practices and sort of monitoring and detection practices that have been used by banks for some time. I think what makes the current situation particularly challenging is that there's a lot more that you can evade now in terms of, again, how expansive and complex the sanctions are. So regulators are taking sort of a number of measures to try to prevent evasion and sort of criminalize evasion, really, which amps up the pressure to comply, not only with what is sort of the letter and intent of the sanctions, but also to actually detect specific evasion tactics as they are employed. And I think we should never forget in the wider context here that when somebody goes on a sanctions list or when their sector is targeted, they are highly incentivized to try to find ways around that. We are dealing with human actors who will try to circumvent controls, and the focus on evasion, the focus on behavior is really to try to stay ahead in that game.
Right. And so presumably, inevitably, the techniques that are used to evade detection become more and more sophisticated all the time, right?
I know yes, I think that's an accurate reflection also of sort of the developments, especially over the past 10, 15 years.
Tim, is there anything you'd share on that point? I know that's kind of an issue close to Windward's heart.
Yeah. For us, we've noticed this trend of the deceptive shipping practices to be more and more aggressive and sophisticated. So it started with, we'll say 6 or 7 years ago, you're just physically changing what your ship looks like, covering up your name, changing your flag, things like that. Then when we started monitoring AIS transmissions and other positional data points, they started turning it off and saying, okay, well, you can't see me doing that. And now they know that we're monitoring for that. And so they've actually started spoofing their location. So that was a trend that we picked up on around May or June of last year. And to a human, it would be impossible to notice because the voyage looks fine. There's no gap in the transmission. If you're just looking at rules, no problem. But to a machine, they notice these geometric patterns in the transmission profile, which looks impossible, or being anchored in a specific location, in a perfect location for any number of time, or traveling and covering the distance of impossible speeds, and with a lost and found event afterwards. So that triggered our analysts to say, hey, there's some impossible movements going on here. Why don't we take a look and verify some of these, bringing into consideration other third-party satellite imagery sources to confirm that we were on the right track, that the AI was picking up something that was accurate. We still keep human in the loop on that because it is a new typology. But yeah, I would say that aside from just being highly motivated, as Neil correctly pointed out, they are highly armed, so to speak, with military-grade technology to spoof their location, because we're talking about tens of millions of dollars in cargo. That it's that operation or spoofing operation is suddenly very worth it and very possible.
Right, I see. Yeah, makes sense. So, Amelie, I wondered if maybe if we could look a little bit past the direct risk of sanctions evasion. When trade flows are restricted in the way they are at the moment, involving Russia, does that have a kind of knock-on effect? Does it mean there could be other kind of illicit movements of goods and funds? So, for example, we've heard a lot of concern in the market recently around trade-based money laundering. To what extent do banks feel like those risks are also ramping up?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and let me give sort of a few examples of some of the issues we're seeing and sort of picking up on right now. And I think they're only really the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we'll be observing over the coming weeks and months. But the moment a trade gets prohibited, something that didn't used to be restricted is now out of bounds, either due to the nature of what that trade is about, can be goods-based, can be service-based, can be industry-based, or it's because it involves targeted counterparties. It's a little bit like a shock to the system. So there's going to be sort of an initial realization among the involved parties, that can be banks, that can be traders, exporters, importers, etc., that they got to find out what to do. If you're sort of, let's say you're in the European Union and you're a responsible actor and you now know and realize that this is prohibited trade, you're going to walk away from that contract and sort of take whatever legal advice you need to get out of it. But if you are the Russian actor, if you are now a targeted party, you're going to start to look around for ways to see if I'm importing something critical into Russia that's critical for my industry, what are the alternative routes that I can potentially source it from? Can I source it through Turkey? Can I source it through China? Can I find alternative providers who are not caught by the current sanctions? And somebody who might also be willing to take the risk of violating those sanctions if they're not strictly legally applicable to them. Some of the measures we are seeing actors sort of take is to use the countries that have not yet or will not impose sanctions against Russia and Belarus, and they're looking for alternative sources of trade there, usually sort of around more of critical goods, critical technology that Russia itself cannot produce. So we are seeing some signs that some of that activity is shifting. If we look more at the export from Russia side, there's now limited take up in the US, the UK, European Union, sort of the Western allies. They're less willing to take Russian imports, especially when they're prohibited, but also more broadly to your point, because there's a degree of caution going on. So in those instances, we start seeing signs of obscurement of those actors trying to set up different types of shell companies, trying to work through different corporate structures to ultimately disguise where are these goods coming from, to try to get them out of Russia, of course, in exchange for hard currency and preferably foreign currency, US dollars and euros, as it were. So those are sort of two of the dynamics we're seeing right now. And I think, again, this is only going to get more sophisticated as we have a bunch of new actors that are trying to adjust, trying to figure out what to do in response to the new sanctions. We also see straight up a falsification of paperwork in terms of bills of lading, sort of documentation that's presented at the point of trade, where you see sanctioned banks that are subject to asset freeze suddenly being removed from documentation, sometimes fairly sloppily, I might add, but also just sort of some of these more traditional ways of trying to obscure funds. I think the jury is still out on what will this mean in terms of trade-based money laundering, over-invoicing, under-invoicing, some of these mechanics that are in the money launderer's toolkit. And we should always remember that sanctions evasion is really just money laundering with a specific purpose. But I think we'll need to monitor that over time to see what magnitude and specifically what methods are being used.
That's really interesting. Thank you. That's an excellent overview of these multifaceted threats that the banks and other companies involved in trade are facing. I think we're going to move on and talk a bit more around strategy now, compliance strategy. But just before we do that, I'd say if anyone in the audience has any questions, anything they'd like to pick up on that's been raised so far, please do submit those, and we can come back to it in a little while. But yeah. So on compliance strategy, then, Amelie, maybe I'll start with you, and then move on to Tim. But in Danske's case, maybe you could talk about how the compliance team is built, and going back to the title of this webinar, this idea of having multiple lines of defense, how does that work in practice? What does that look like from an outsider's point of view?
Right. So let me sort of highlight two things in relation to that question. And the first is more generic. What do regulators tell us to do, tell corporate actors to do, sort of in the sanctions compliance domain? And then give a little bit of a story on how we've dealt with this in Danske Bank. And I think a lot of people in the audience will be aware of our compliance history. There's been some issues related to our former branch in Estonia. We also used to have a branch in Russia. All of that is now closed. So there's some lessons that we've sort of drawn from as we have really been trying to build out over the past few years. But if we look at the basic question of, if you're a corporate actor, how do you comply with sanctions? You comply with sanctions by having a sanctions compliance program. This is a concept that both OFAC, of course, Treasury, but also the European Union has increasingly sort of been flagging over the past few years. And we now have specific guidance on what is actually meant with a compliance program, what pillars does it encompass, what are the capabilities you need to have in place to have a risk-based program that will be reflective of the sanctions risk, the inherent and the residual risk that you have in your operations. So sometimes I describe it in the way that sanctions compliance program, those are now the magical words that a regulator will expect you to say. They will expect you can document what that program is, and they will expect that you can demonstrate to them the efficiency and efficacy of that program, and specifically what risks you are that the program has really been set up to mitigate. Now, if you're a bank, those risks are going to be multifaceted. They're going to sort of go across your operations. The more financial services you have, the higher your sanctions risk. Whereas if you're a smaller operator, let's say you're a smaller shipping company, you're going to be dealing with a different set of risks because your business is different. There are different ways where your services can get abused for sanctions reasons. But by and large, the answer is you need to have a sanctions compliance program. If we then sort of turn the conversation back to Danske Bank, we are sort of a medium-sized bank. We have around 25,000 employees. We operate sort of globally, but with a focus in the Nordic markets. But we have a large trade footprint in the Nordics because we end up operating as in many ways as sort of the payment channel in and outside of the Nordics for the local corporates who wish to conduct global business. So we have a fairly sort of multitude of sanctions risks if we look in terms of our business operations. So how we structured our compliance program, our sanctions compliance program, has really been to address those risks. We have been investing heavily and really building it up since 2018 when we started a larger compliance and financial crime compliance remediation program. So our sanctions compliance program is really part of that. It's part of how we are both building for the future. We're not done yet. If you look sort of in the public domain, you'll see some commentary around some of the remedial actions that we still have left to do as a bank. But I'm happy to sort of say that we are sort of well on the way in terms of delivering on that, which is serving us well in the current situation. The 3 lines of defense model, it is not so much a financial crime compliance model as it is this is sort of the way that the industry over time has found its feet in terms of how do you structure your compliance. The 3 lines of defense model in the European context is mandated by the European Central Bank as a model of operation for financial institutions. It's not really an optional model. It's something you have to employ. But it is also tried and tested, if you will. So for banks, it's sort of not a question of whether you're going to apply a 3 lines of defense model, but how are you going to do it? The 3 lines of defense model, for those who are unfamiliar with it, I sometimes describe it as the Swiss cheese model of security, where you're going to have multiple layers of protection, of compliance controls. None of those layers are going to be perfect. They're all going to have holes in them if you sort of imagine 3 slices of Swiss cheese. So you know that there are going to be risks that will materialize by going through the first level of defense. That's why you have the second line of defense, which typically is your compliance and your risk, and sometimes parts of your legal function, again, depending on how you have implemented the 3 lines of defense model. And the second line is also not perfect either, which is why we have the 3rd line of defense, which is typically the compliance function or sort of the audit function, if you will. that really comes in and sort of tests that everybody's been doing what they were supposed to be doing. And in that model, your risk only materializes if none of the 3 lines of defense had mitigated whatever gap it was that you had in your program. So that's what makes it effective. I could talk about this for a long time, but I won't. So let me stop there and hand it back to you.
Oh, excellent! Thank you. That's a perfect overview. So Tim, where does technology fit into this? You've already talked about the kind of techniques that are used to evade detection. How can you, as a bank or another institution, how can you incorporate those ideas into your compliance strategy?
Well, having spent 4 years on what I would consider line of defense 2.5, which was quality assurance, I've noticed a couple things when I see friction points between first line of defense, second line of defense, and third line of defense, which is, it's kind of like funny stories, but when I sat in a lot of arbitration meetings where, let's say, the screening protocol, the screening team, and then the due diligence team, and then eventually like an advanced investigations team, if they were not aligned, and ultimately it goes to the front end of the business. If there was ever a line of defense in second or third that disagreed with the first line of defense around judgment, right? So if line of defense 2 turns to the front office and says, listen, I looked at the risk a little differently than you did, and my matrix says that this is actually high risk and it has to be resolved in this way. There's a lot of friction between the two. But if the further lines of defense said, hey, I found some new piece of information that's material to the discussion, and here it is, suddenly all the lines of defenses in the front office and back office are synchronized because they're now seeing the picture the same way. As Emil pointed out, that it's expected that you're going to have holes in one side to another. So there seems to be no friction in introducing new information, but a lot of friction if you're looking at the same piece of information, say, I calculate the risk differently, let's do it again. And suddenly you burn a lot of calories in arbitration and you're wasting a lot of time. So where technology fits in is making sure that you have the same reference point, the same information along the way, but different levels of access. So that way at different stages, they're getting more information, you have the ability to investigate further. So in earlier lines of defense, you want to make sure that you're using the same type of screening information, the same watch lists, et cetera, the same behavioral indicators. But then when it triggers to the next line of defense, that next line of defense is capable of looking at information a little bit more specifically, a little bit more advanced, and to quickly present that information to earlier stages and either sign off on the risk or don't sign off on the risk. But that's what makes it a comprehensive strategy, is making sure that you have the same type of information. We all agree on what the common operating picture is, but at different levels, there's new and more information, and the interface is more sophisticated as you go on and on. So that way you can clearly communicate to earlier stages exactly what's going on, and there's not a lot of time spent in arbitration.
Great, thank you. We've had a question actually that I think that ties into this point. So it's probably a good time to go to that now. I reckon. So the question is, when relying on technology, how do you make sure that that doesn't just generate more false positives and basically end up slowing you down rather than making you more efficient?
Is that to me? You want me to address that one?
Yeah. Sorry, yeah. Tim,
no, cool.
But yeah.
Yeah, great. Great question. Well, you have to model it out first. Take a sampling of the population that you'd expect, run it against a new type of risk you want to screen against, and then in that environment, we'll call it like a proof of concept environment, start to dial in on what you would consider a false positive and what's a false negative. Because you could have false positives when it comes to identity resolution, and you can say, oh, I thought this was my identity, but it's not, or it's not the identity, but it is. So it's like one level of false positives that you need to overcome. And the next set is actual risk. So there is a lot of false positives in the behavioral risk domain for traditional solutions around, vessel movements, because there's not a clear distinction between what's considered an AIS gap or a disruption versus a true, what we call dark activity. So making sure that you have really good identity resolution on the first half of that problem and really strong behavioral analytics using what I would say machine learning and AI. So continually get improves and improves and improves. And then do it in a proof of concept environment. And when you feel as though you're not going to get hit with a lot of false positives, incorporate that into your normal compliance framework. I would not recommend adding another component to it just for this. It's important to just try to nest it into your already existing compliance framework. But yeah, there's ways to do it, but I always start with a demo POC environment before you turn on that risk, and you really can stop the presses, so to speak.
Excellent. Amelie, is there anything you wanted to add on the false positives point?
No, I think Tim covered it really well, and in some ways, sort of going back to what your risks are, what are you really trying to control against, what you're trying to comply with, can be a helpful sort of guidepost as you make choices around, how are you specifically going to calibrate, what are you going to look at, what are you going to dedicate resources to, and what are you just not going to be able to give as high a level of review as other sort of higher risk alerts and higher risk indicators.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Excellent. So we've had another question through which relates to what we were talking about at the start with the controls on Russia. A really interesting question. Amelie, maybe I'll come to you on this first. So, do you have any recommendations for additional controls that could be applied to export finance transactions or trade finance export transactions to countries that are Russia friendly at the moment? And they said beyond just identifying who the end users are. So, if you are financing exports to, it could be China or India or somewhere, are there additional steps you could be taking now to ensure you're not ultimately benefiting Russia?
Right. So there are three things you can do from the perspective of doing enhanced due diligence on transactions like that, or you could, if you're already doing enhanced due diligence, let's call it enhanced due diligence plus, where you're looking for the specific risks there. And the things that I would look for is verification of ultimate beneficial owners for your counterparties. So that would mean, are there any intermediaries in the transaction, and who own them, who have influence over them, who ultimately sort of pulls the plug on that supply chain, as it were? Who are your end users? Who are sort of the ultimate recipients of the goods, and who are their ultimate beneficial owners? Doing that type of analysis will not necessarily yield you the answer as to who is the beneficial owner, because that can be very difficult in the Russia context to actually determine, but it will tell you whether there are additional red flags that you need to look into. So let's imagine you've sort of expanded your due diligence, sort of your verification requirements for those higher risk transactions, and you run into some red flags. Maybe you can't figure out if there's actually an oligarch involved at the end of the day who may be on one of the sanctions lists. The next thing you can then do is engage with your counterparties and ask for compliance attestations from them, sanctions compliance attestations, reaching out to them and trying to understand what is their approach to the relevant sanctions. Are they in compliance with them, or are they not in compliance for different reasons? Could be legal, could be conflict of law reasons, which will, again, not solve the problem for you, but it will give you an additional layer of comfort that you know what risk you're looking at, and you know what risk you would be taking if you were to enter into that deal. And then the third thing that you can do, if you're very unsure, is to ask for external review. Let's say that there's parts of your investigation where your own tooling is just not giving you the answers that you want. You have residual concerns, you have residual red flags. going to a specialized provider for those higher risk transactions can be a good idea. It might not be a silver bullet. It might not give you the clear do go ahead or do not go ahead, but it will give you some additional certainty and also make sure that whatever decision you make about that transaction will be defensible, even if it turns out ultimately that you strayed sort of into the gray or maybe even into sort of the black areas.
Right. Okay. Just picking up on your first point around enhanced due diligence. So, I mean, should you be doing enhanced due diligence on those kinds of transactions just by default, or is there a way you can kind of filter out whether or not you need to do that from the off? Because I'd imagine that would capture quite a lot of transactions for some institutions.
Right. So it has to be risk-based at the end of the day. We do not have infinite resources to use for compliance investigations. In the ideal world, you would want to subject much larger volumes of transactions to a higher level of due diligence review than is possible. In this case, where we need to make some choices around where do we put our resources, I would say define what types of transactions you assess to be higher risk due to the new sanctions, due to the new situations, due to how dynamic and operating environment we are in right now. And go all out on those, which will also give you good indications on whether are you sort of chasing ghosts, or are you is there something there? Do you have some problematic counterparties in your supply chains? Are you doing business that you want to take a fresh look at, or maybe reassess in view of the new restrictions?
Great, thank you. And just on the beneficial ownership point, Tim, we've had a question that relates to a point you made earlier around Russian ownership of vessels. So the question is, with exports, most carriers have indicated their vessels are not related to Russian ownership, but they lease a portion of their fleet, and the ownership of leased vessels is not very transparent. Is there a way to mitigate that risk?
There is. You basically have to have visibility on all 7 levels of ownership and the charter party, and make sure that you have sources that are market sources of information, which change, day to day, rather than sources that change annually. Let's say an ownership data source that says, you get an update every time they redo their insurance forms, for instance, on the vessel. So making sure that you prove the concept there, you do some control testing, and you ask your vendors, like, how often does this information get refreshed? What's the velocity as well as the accuracy of your information in order to screen against something like that? And ultimate beneficial owner is an industry-wide problem to find. But making sure you have a sanctions program and a compliance program that shows that you're doing the due diligence, that there are sources out there, you've done the checks. If there was information out there you found, you did look for it. So just double tapping with your vendors that you already have, or whoever you're using to ingest information, to understand the velocity up front, and then making sure that you're using the best information that is available, and being able to defend that there is a limit to perfect information.
Excellent. Okay. Well, actually, we've had another question that I think perfectly fits with that, with your answer there, which is around whether there is a way of kind of scientifically measuring the effectiveness of your systems. Presumably, that's a huge challenge.
Yeah. So we do self-diagnostics on our own systems, but as far as procedures, I'm going to lean on my quality assurance background, which was, we would do statistical sampling. You'd come up with a script to test a process, and you would sample scientifically somewhere around at least 200 samples, depending on the population size of whatever case. They could be a due diligence report, it could be a KYC report, it could be account alerts and decisions on that. Whatever you want to prove scientifically, do a statistical sampling, come up with a script that asks the right questions, and most importantly, make sure that when quality assurance is answering those questions, They're not just saying defect or no defect. You know, did you fail this part of the script? They're saying, they're going that step further and saying, was there an outcome? Did I find material information that you did not? Or did you just not do a check and I did the check and it's okay, there's no problem with it. We got lucky. So being able to dedicate a small amount of resources to do scientific statistical population sampling and get you that ground truth on that level, so you can know what is your error rate, and then also of your error rate, which one of those have material outcomes that are important to the bank. And that's how you can prove one way or another how effective your controls are, and then what kind of risk that you still need to account for, and maybe bolster up a line of defense, or if needed to add a whole another line of defense.
Great, thanks very much. Amelie, was there anything you wanted to add on either of those questions, or should we move on?
So I think there is one additional measure that you can look at in addition to what Tim said, of course, which is to think we focus a lot on false positives, but really you have sort of 4 categories that you probably want to be looking at. False positives is one, but also false negatives. So you want to sort of see false positives, false negatives, positive positives, positive negatives, right? And sort of look across the space of what outcomes do you have, how much within the positive category are you missing with your current calibration, with your current system. You can do what's sometimes referred to as below the line testing, which is where if you have a specific matching threshold that's here, you're going to be looking at the stuff that's just below that and try to see, would there be any true positives or positives in there that you want to set some metric around, what's your risk tolerance for missing those, and balancing that against how much you're going to be amping up your false positives. And this is it's maybe more of a helpful heuristic for yourself when you're looking at all of those false positives and you're going, oh my God, how do we get the false positive ratio down? But you need to do that in a way where you're not compromising your ability to look at the positive positives. So framing it sort of that, in addition to the statistical analysis that Tim mentioned, I do find quite helpful.
That's great. Thank you very much. Okay, so just sticking on this point around some of the challenges while we have a little bit of time, is there an issue around the kind of need for immediacy of transactions? So I think people expect for example, their banking partners to move quickly. But if you do need to carry out some kind of enhanced due diligence and take a really kind of deep look at whether something might be suspicious, how can you kind of reconcile those two positions? Amelie, maybe I'll start with you, and then I'll move on to Tim.
Right. So I think that there is a strong push in the financial sector for the type of efficiency that will allow transactions that are time critical for whatever reasons to be carried out as swiftly as possible. So as the new sanctions get absorbed, as new sanctions are imposed, there can be an experience that everything stops while the banks and the investigators try to work out what does this mean in terms of whatever we have on the books, whatever we're trying to process. And then it does take a little time before the efficiency in terms of making those types of determinations really kicks in. And then everything sort of goes back to normal after a while in the ideal world. I think what's been problematic over the past 6 weeks, again, is that the sanctions have changed almost daily. So you might have put something into the system, you might have tried to carry out something on day X that was then prohibited the next day. So that creates sort of some friction and also some time considerations in terms of whether those transactions can be carried out at all, and certainly whether they can be carried out efficiently. I think during 2014, when we had the invasion of Crimea and the resulting sectoral sanctions as they were imposed by the European Union and the US at the time, some transactions completely irregular took 3 to 4 weeks to process because the financial sector needed to find its way around and build in the right compliance processes to be able to do that safely. And I think I've heard, at least anecdotally, that some of the same types of processing times are happening now as well. And because we have a much more complex set of new restrictions to absorb and implement, unfortunately, I think that friction is going to be there for a while.
Right. Okay. And Tim, is there anything you'd pick up on that side?
Yeah, I mean, as far as the speed and of the sanctions, as Emil pointed out, how rapidly things are changing, and the expectation in the market, and there's also an expectation for these moral sanctions. So not only are we're trying to keep up with what the law is, we're also trying to keep up with the fact that reputational risk has suddenly become transactional risk. The 20,000 longshoremen in California said that they're not going to take any containers off of a ship. Okay, so now there's a transactional risk to that investment, and that previously would be considered just under due diligence, as far as maybe there's a reputation risk here, but now that reputation risk turns into a transaction risk beyond just how does this look at our own, stock price as far as doing business with Russia. You face a transaction risk. Similar thing happened. A major energy company purchases oil. There was a carve out at the time with Russia in order to transport to the U.S. They get hit with a Twitter mob of, you should not have done this. They reverse course and say, you know what, we're sorry. Yeah, we're not going to do this. So not only the speed to keep up, but you have to have this predictive ability of what is also going to happen. And the only way I believe you could be able to keep up with the predictive requirement is one, use technology that can see behaviors beyond just, matching what the letter of the law is and updating your system, but also making sure that you're investing a lot in digitizing your transaction flow, because that really slows things down. If you have a slow or incumbent KYC or onboarding or trade document process, that's what adds days and maybe even weeks or beyond to the process. So investing in digitizing is always a smart move when it comes to trade documents.
That's great. Thank you very much. So on that predictive note, I think we can probably move to one of our last questions here. If anyone does still have any questions for the panelists, please do submit those now through the Q&A function, because we don't have too much time left to get to those. So finally, what do you anticipate is going to be the next challenge? So, for example, it could be with the Russia situation. Do you see the momentum moving in a particular direction? Maybe tighter controls on energy or something like that, or maybe the risk of secondary sanctions. What are you kind of braced for next? Emily, I'll start with you.
Right, so I love these types of crystal bowling exercise, because ultimately time will tell whether we are correct or not. So just take this with sort of all of the uncertainty associated with prediction, even for seasoned commentators who got caught by surprise in terms of the sanctions that have been imposed over the past 6 weeks, and of course also the events that led to it. But I do think at this point in time that there is appetite to go after the energy payments in a more structured way. We've seen some signals from the European Commission last week that it is being explored, specifically export restrictions on import of Russian oil. And one interesting feature of how the European Union has put a lot of their sanctions into law over the past 6 weeks has been that they are much more willing to include specific derogations and specific exceptions into the actual legal text, which means that they're placing reliance on the private sector to, for example, read a restriction: do not import Russian oil, but here are some carve-outs that you can use to see you through a time of crisis or through the next winter, whatever it might be. So I do think that we are going to go further down the route of restricting some energy payments. And again, time will tell whether I'm right. If we look more generally into some of the other prohibitions, there's not a lot in Russia left to sanction at this point in time. So unless you go after the energy payments, the next natural route is going to be to really amp up enforcement, to say we've now implemented a bunch of sanctions that we believe are effective, should be effective. Now we got to go out and ensure really strict enforcement and really contingent enforcement of those, which presents an interesting challenge because usually sanctions enforcement actions, they're years in the making. They can take a very, very long time to investigate and settle. But if you want to give effect to certainly the European Union and the UK sanctions rapidly, you got to step up the enforcement game as well and be able to do that much more rapidly than maybe in the past. So that's something else we're sort of monitoring and trying to see how strong of a hammer is that going to be against both banks, but also industry actors who vert sort of on fly a little bit too close to the sun or end up with investigations on their hands.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, that's a great point. Tim, anything you'd add looking into the crystal ball?
Yeah, the crystal ball tells everything, but compliments, because Neil, that was a great answer, because one of the few things that you can actually confidently say is that we're going to transition into an enforcement phase. So yeah, so compliments to you. I couldn't agree more. From a vessel standpoint, vessel behavior standpoint, I think ship-to-ship screening or screening for ship-to-ship activities is going to become more vital. Maybe looking at one more layer of what ship connected to what ship, what connected to what ship, because at the end of the day, there is going to be a tremendous amount of Russian oil in the high seas, and it's got to go somewhere. It's going to get discounted price, obviously, to the actors that are willing to still trade openly, and also to the ones that are willing to trade not openly. So I think that ship-to-ship risk is going to increase and needs to be a new type of typology that we pay close attention to. And being able to identify what I would call blending operations, or the industry would call blending operations, where you basically just have a VLCC sitting off the coast, it's anchored, takes oil from multiple sources, and you take it out, and you don't know how much percentage is Russian. So that's where I see things going. Agree with Amelia about the enforcement phase kicking in, where basically governments said, we gave you a running start, now I expect it to execute. And then just behaviorally how that's going to play out is through ship-to-ship transactions and screening against that.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much. And that's bang on time. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. But it's a great forward-looking note to end on. Thanks so much to Amelie and Tim for joining me today, and also to Scott and the team at BAFT. I'll hand back to Scott in a moment. And of course to everyone for listening and for submitting your questions. So yeah, thanks again. Goodbye, and over to you, Scott.
I really want to say thanks to Amelie, Timothy, and John. I think it was a highly informative, topical conversation. I would just kind of advise everyone to stay tuned for this space going forward. This isn't the end of the story. I think this is unfortunately a new normal, and it's only going to get more complex and perhaps vexing as the multitude of sanctions pile up and become ever more complex as to how to keep ahead of these. The challenge, of course, there's always this creative tension, is how do you make sure that you're fulfilling the requirements of a sanctions regime, at the same time meet the required expediency the trade demands. Trade doesn't wait; it needs to move on, and so this is really going to be the challenge for everyone going forward. So again, thanks very much. I see from the feedback that everyone thought this was a highly informative session.